The house stood alone, perched atop Deadman's Hill like a solitary sentinel. It was a rambling Victorian mansion, its once grand facade now weathered and grey. Local legend painted it as a place of tragedy and mystery. Elliot Price, a man of logic, scoffed at such tales. He inherited the house from a distant relative. Despite the stories, Elliot saw an opportunity. The house, though dilapidated, held potential. Armed with skepticism, Elliot arrived at Deadman's Hill. He paused, gazing up at the imposing structure. Undeterred, Elliot started up the winding path. Taking a deep breath, he stepped across the threshold. The silence was absolute. The silence inside the house was not merely the absence of sound. It was a tangible presence, heavy and oppressive. Elliot stood in the foyer, his footsteps echoing strangely in the stillness. He ran a hand along the dusty surface of an antique table, surprised by the lack of sound. It was as if the house itself was absorbing all noise, swallowing it whole. He moved from room to room, each one draped in shadows and thick with dust. The silence followed him, relentless and unnerving. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy. He began to feel a sense of unease, a prickling at the back of his neck. The rational part of his mind told him it was simply the isolation, the years of neglect that had settled upon the house. But deep down, a primal instinct whispered that something was deeply wrong. He tried to open a window, hoping to let in some sound, some semblance of the outside world. But the windows were jammed shut, painted over as if to seal the house in an eternal, soundless tomb. As the days turned into nights, the silence began to change. It was no longer an empty void, but a canvas upon which other, subtler sounds began to bleed through. At first it was just a whisper, a faint rustling that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Elliot tried to ignore it, attributing it to the creaking of an old house settling into itself. But the whispers persisted, growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, slithering through the walls, along the floorboards, swirling around him like unseen spectres. Occasionally, he thought he could distinguish voices, faint and desperate, calling out from within the very fabric of the house. The house was alive with the whispers of the dead. Driven by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, Elliot began to actively search for the source of the whispers. He scoured the house from top to bottom, his footsteps echoing in the now almost familiar silence. He checked every nook and cranny, every hidden corner, but found nothing. The whispers seemed to mock him, their ethereal voices swirling around him, always just out of reach. Just when his hope began to dwindle, he stumbled upon a loose floorboard in the attic. He knelt down, prying at the board with his fingers. It creaked open, revealing a dark, gaping hole beneath. A musty, earthy smell wafted up from the opening, sending a wave of nausea through him. Elliot grabbed a lantern from a nearby shelf, his hand trembling slightly. He held his breath, peering down into the darkness. The opening led to a narrow, dirt-floored crawl space. He could see a faint light emanating from the far end. Hesitantly, Elliot lowered himself into the crawl space, his heart pounding in his chest. The dolls were crudely made, fashioned from scraps of cloth and bone. Each one was unique, crafted with a disturbing attention to detail. Some wore tattered clothing, others had hair made of human hair, and some even bore crudely drawn faces, contorted in expressions of agony and despair. But it was the eyes that held Elliot's gaze. They were all different, buttons, beads, even tiny pebbles. Yet they all seemed to stare back at him with an unnerving life of their own. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the cold, rough surface of one doll. It was then that he noticed the names. Scrawled on the chests of the dolls in a spidery faded script were names, dozens of names, each one representing a soul trapped within the confines of this cursed house. A wave of compassion washed over Elliot, a stark contrast to the fear that had gripped him just moments before. These were not monsters, not demons, but people. People who had lived, loved and lost their very essence, now trapped within these crude dolls. He felt a powerful urge to help them, to free them from their torment. But a nagging voice at the back of his mind whispered a warning. What if releasing these souls unleashed something far worse? He had heard the local legends, the whispers of an ancient evil that resided within the house, an entity that fed on the silence and the suffering. What if these trapped souls served as a barrier, a buffer between the world of the living and something truly malevolent? He was torn. On one hand, he couldn't bear the thought of these souls suffering for eternity. On the other, the potential consequences of their release were terrifying to contemplate. In the end, it was the whispers that swayed him. They grew louder, more insistent, echoing his own desperation. He couldn't ignore the suffering any longer. He decided to risk it all and attempt a ritual of release. He found an old leather-bound book in the attic. Its pages were filled with strange symbols and incantations. He hoped it held the key to freeing the trapped souls. He arranged the dolls in a circle. He lit candles, their flames casting shadows. He began to recite the words, his voice growing in strength. The air grew thick with unseen energy. The whispers intensified, swirling around him. The dolls began to tremble, twitching with life. Fear pierced through Elliot's resolve. The house roared. It was a sound that defied description, a guttural howl of rage and despair that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the building. The floor beneath Elliot buckled, throwing him off balance. The candles extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. He scrambled back, shielding his eyes from the falling debris as the walls around him groaned and twisted. The house was fighting back, its fury unleashed by his attempt to disrupt the balance it had so carefully maintained. The dolls thrashed violently, their button eyes glowing with an eerie, malevolent light. The whispers transformed into screams, a chorus of anguish and fury that reverberated through the collapsing room. Elliot stumbled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get out, had to escape the wrath of the house before it consumed him along with its prisoners. He emerged from the crawl space into the attic, his clothes torn and his body battered. The house shuddered around him, the roof groaning under the weight of its own demise. He stumbled to his feet, his legs shaky beneath him, and made his way towards the attic stairs. He burst through the front door and into the cool night air, just as the house behind him imploded in on itself. He watched in stunned silence as the once imposing structure crumbled into a pile of rubble, dust and debris billowing into the night sky. The screams were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow louder, more profound than any sound he'd ever heard. He had escaped, but the experience had changed him irrevocably. He turned and walked away from the ruins of Deadman's Hill, the silence following him like a shadow. Elliot Price left Deadman's Hill, but a part of him remained trapped within the rubble, forever bound to the horrors he had witnessed. He tried to rebuild his life, to outrun the memories that haunted his waking hours and invaded his dreams. But the silence followed him, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of the world. He heard whispers in the wind, saw faces in the shadows, felt the chill of unseen eyes upon him. He knew then that he had not escaped, not entirely. He had merely delayed the inevitable. The evil that resided in that house, the entity that fed on silence and suffering, was ancient, timeless. For in the silence, evil whispered, and sometimes it listened.